So, good morning, everyone. I'm delighted to welcome you all to the second of our series of webinars on neuroeducation and neuroplasticity. So, the title of the series is really that Unlocking Cognitive Potential Through Neuroplasticity, and today's session is about foreign language acquisition. We'll go into that in a second. I'm the director of IngoC Cognitive Enhancement Center. We operate here in Portugal and also online. And we operate in two languages, in English and Portuguese. And my name is Sara Santos. I run this company and I am a facilitator of many of the programs that we deliver. Now, that's several things we do in IngoC. We provide education consulting and we looking at schools, homeschooling, including alternative education, several strands, academic support, which also includes intensive holiday programs, and cognitive enhancement. And the cognitive enhancement is the focus of today. Okay, so my company, IngoC, by the way, is cogni from cognition, read backwards. So my company is an accredited provider of the Arrowsmith program. And before we get into the details of what Tara has to tell us today, to think about cognitive enhancement, I'm inviting you to join me in a mind shift, okay? And that shift is, instead of thinking of skills-based education, I'm inviting you to think of neuroeducation. That means that in skills-based, we're looking at things we learn and things that we perfect over time, whereas when we're looking at cognitive enhancement and neuroeducation, we're looking at the brain structures and their development that allows us to learn those skills or to perform those skills. So we're not looking at skills, we're looking at what sits underneath that at the brain, okay? And that is an invitation for a mind shift, not to be accomplished in a couple of seconds, but I'm inviting you to go on that journey with us. To every time we talk about something quite unfamiliar, we'll say, oh, hang on a minute. Okay, let me go back to what Sarah said on thinking of brain structures rather than skills, okay? So what I mean by this is that cognitive enhancement isn't tutoring, isn't skills-based, it's not academic, and it's not about tricks or strategies. All these things I mentioned are skill-based. Cognitive enhancement is about increasing the brain capacity. And that is what I like about this view, is that it is the future of education. Neuroeducation, seeing the school and other education opportunities as ways of strengthening the brain, the capacity to learn, so that the academics or even professional training can just be learned. The brain can just get on with it, okay? So that means that we work on developing the brain, not strategies and not skills. Of course, you need those, but we prep the brain so that that can be done. So that means that when we look at a capacity-based approach, such as what we're going to talk about today, we're looking at the learner's cognitive abilities to be strengthened and enhanced. That means we change the brain and the structures that allow learning, and we'll be targeting specific networks in the brain that need strengthening for that learning to be able to be done smoothly. Okay. Now, I will give you an analogy here, okay? I already gave you the tools and the brain structures part, but I'm going to put it in another perspective. Let's think of skills and support, such as tutoring or making changes in our learning environment, or breaking things down into steps, as a life-saving boat, that it's really important for us to stay afloat if we're working on something that is difficult for whatever reason, okay? Now, what we're looking for in cognitive enhancement is build bridges, so you don't need the life-saving boat. Okay, so that's the angle we're on here, cognitive enhancement. And so having set that ground there, I would like to introduce our speaker of today. Um, and to put context here, I've been talking to the team in Toronto because Smith is based in Toronto, in Canada. And we've been talking about the needs of many people in my community, and foreign language acquisition is a challenge for many of us. I don't mean about, languages being hard. Yes, they are hard, but when we're looking at what actually happens at the brain level when a person has a trend in finding foreign languages harder than typically expected. So, so I'm delighted that Tara Bonner, the Chief Neuroeducation Officer at the Smith program, is with us today. It's very early in Canada right now, in Toronto. Tara spent nearly 20 years bridging the gap between neuroscience and education. She's an educator, a leader, a consultant, and a speaker. And Tara has been collaborating with educators, leaders, and clients worldwide on all neuroeducation matters. So join me in welcoming Tara today, and we will have a chance to ask her questions at the end of her presentation. So Tara, I will stop sharing and give you space to do that. So thank you.
Thank you so much. I do hope everyone can see my screen. Give me a thumbs up or a, a digital nod. Thank you so much for the kind introduction. And I love you said, let's get on with the brain. And I think that's a beautiful way of getting started. Let's get on with it. Today, I come to you, as Sarah said, from Toronto. I'm really grateful also to have learned a little bit about you in your registration notes. So I understand a number of you are learning a new language yourself. Others of you are supporting students in a new language. Still, others of you are parents or grandparents helping children navigate languages. So while our paths and our geographies getting here may be somewhat different, we all have a shared experience, which is we all know people who seem to be picking up languages seemingly effortlessly. They go on holiday and it's as though they've picked up a language like they do a souvenir. They come back and they're more than comfortable with playing with language, vocabulary, and it seems very natural to them. And then there's the rest of us. We study vocabulary, we practice pronunciation, we use apps, we hire tutors, and yet it still doesn't stick. And over time, that experience leads to a very common conclusion that I'm just not good at languages. Now, early in my teaching career, I lived and worked across Latin America, several countries for several years, almost 4 years. And yet, throughout that time, I never really learned Spanish, not in a way that matched the environment I was in every day. And I told myself a story, really the only reasonable explanation I had at the time, that I was lazy, that I wasn't trying hard enough, that I was incapable. And if I was honest, it wasn't a new experience because it brought me back to my high school French class, where I was completely lost. Despite doing fairly well in school and learning and performance in general, French class always felt like a black hole. And at the time, I blamed my teacher. She didn't like me. I didn't like her. She wasn't creative or interesting enough. But deep down, the root of my frustration was the same. It was my fear that I wasn't bright enough, or I wasn't trying hard enough, that there was something about me that didn't work when it came to language. And only after I came back to Canada, after struggling for years in Spanish, I came across an explanation, a different explanation. And it was one that didn't just change how I understood language learning, it changed how I understood ability. And that explanation I came across was a way of looking at learning through the brain. A cognitive lens means this. It means using neuroscience to explain, to understand, even to improve how we navigate the world. It means by using our brains, our cognitive capacity to see the world and see ourselves. Because our brains shape everything we do. More specifically, these cognitive functions work together to determine all of our actions and reactions. Right now, as you're sitting in this webinar, your brain is filtering, prioritizing, remembering, making meaning through these different cognitive functions. And there are a number of them. There are ones, each one has a very specific job. One's responsible for finding our way through a new city, paying attention to a podcast, noticing someone's new haircut, remembering the names of a character of a book, picking up on social cues. Each one at any one time is working together to complete that task. So that's the first, let's call it a takeaway that I want you to have in mind today, is that multiple systems, cognitive functions working together in real time is how we engage. Learning is not a single skill. And what we'll soon see is that language is not a single skill. It is a full-brained activity. And the most concrete way I would love to share that with you is to introduce you to my gorgeous new nephew, William here. William has just turned 1 this month. And if you've ever watched a child at this age, of course, it's remarkable. He's so active. He's experimenting with sound. He's repeating patterns. No one is sitting him down to teach him vocabulary. No one is correcting his grammar. But all of this babbling and repeated partial words is actually doing something extraordinary. His brain is changing. His brain is, he's building a brain that processes language in a very specific way. This is William's first language, but it's literally shaping the networks and connections, the foundations within his brain to engage with this language. And he's tuning into the sounds he hears most often. And he's processing the most common structures of language. And he's building meaning and templates across these higher frequencies. Now, he's 1. So the complexity of those rules and patterns are not sophisticated, but cognitively, there is wildly active electric movements in his brain. All of that stimuli is changing his brain, and ultimately in the structure and in the function of his brain. Now, interestingly, we come to today where we can explore that not all languages ask the brain to do the same thing. Some rely heavily on sound distinctions. Others rely more on structure. Others rely on symbols or symbolic meaning. And in those early years for all of us, our brains are responding to the unique nature of our native or our mother tongue. So when you learn a second language, you're actually asking your brain to process language in a new way. Now, in my sister's house, it's a family affair today, in my sister's house, my brother-in-law speaks Mandarin. And my kids love to ask him to say, "Is your mother scolding the horse?" Now, does anyone know why? It's so delightful for my kids to hear my brother-in-law say, "Is your mother scolding the horse?" in Mandarin. Let me give it a try. Ma, 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 ma. Now, you might not have even heard those distinctions, and they're even harder to pronounce. I promise I don't have it right. But if you don't grow up hearing and pronouncing those distinctions, your brain isn't tuned in. So exactly as Sarah said, when language feels harder, it's because you're asking your brain to do something it is not yet wired to do. It's not yet wired to do. So it's not happening automatically. It's not an academic skill that you acquire, that you pick up, that you learn or memorize. It's a whole brain activity. Now, speaking of international languages, of course, it's a World Cup year. So in my house, soccer or football, whatever you're going to call it, is everything right now. And it turns out it's a very useful way to think about language. I want you to think about the brain like a soccer team. Because this team is your language team, particularly your second language team. In other words, this is a team of cognitive functions. Each player has a very specific position on that team. Each cognitive function is a player on this team, and each cognitive function has a very specific job or role or position on the team. One will hear the subtle differences in speech sounds, like you've just tried to do earlier. Another will hold on to those sounds and integrate them into words. Still another will put meaning to those words. Another will put meaning and structure to the sentences. And a whole other group of players, the offensive end, will handle the written output, the mechanics of reading and writing. Several cognitive functions are under or part of that. Even our eyes tracking across a page is a cognitive function. There are also captains or coaches who make the essential decisions in this task, in this game. They coordinate the plays, they call the plays. There's different cognitive functions responsible for attention, for decision-making, for thinking, for flexibility under pressure. They all have different roles. No single player can win the game alone. They have to work together in real time to execute the play. And they have to be well-trained, well-conditioned. So I'll say it again, language is not one skill or one ability or one player. There's not a single language area of the brain. It's a coordinated team effort. Now, anything I share with you today, by the way, I appreciate this slide might be quite small for one of you. I'm happy to share some resources with Sarah after the presentation, and she'll be happy to share them with you. So, as I said, each player has a different role. What's also an important dimension is that each player, each cognitive function varies in their capacity. They are operating along a continuum from strong to weak. And if a player is undertrained, if they tire quickly, if they make more errors, if they fall out of position, then the whole play or even the whole team starts to break down. Now, in some cases, there might be a player strong enough to compensate if they can. So attention might have to work harder to stay focused, or parts of memory may have to get involved to retrieve. And sometimes that works if the players are really strong, or if the task allows that type of compensation. But in general, the team is operating inefficiently and under strain when this happens, when there are weaker players. And in some cases, you can't expect, the keeper to score a goal. There's going to be gaps in that game, in that play, learning experience, when there are weaker, particularly if there are cognitive functions or players that are particularly important in the task. That said, not all players are used equally. And I promise you I won't go too much longer with this analogy, but it really is powerful in recognizing the dynamic nature of our brains and how our cognitive functions work together. But not all players are involved equally. In other words, some cognitive functions you'll notice in every task we do. So if we break down language acquisition into listening, into speaking, into reading and writing, you'll see some players are on the field all the time. Processing memory, for example, memory for words are involved in almost every play, but others are more situational. Motor planning, for example, becomes critical for writing when we have to, when our hand memorizes effectively a motor plan for a certain word. There's a cognitive function that's responsible for teaching our hand millions even of motor plans. So when we write a word in our language and someone in another language, that word comes out of our hand either in typing or with pen automatically. Well, that's not being used necessarily for speech, but it's absolutely being used for writing. So depending on the task, different players, different cognitive functions are being called into action. And that's why you can see someone strong in a certain context, but struggle in another. I think it's very common for many of us to be more comfortable reading in our new language, in our emerging second language, than in speaking or even listening. More cognitive functions are involved, more cognitive functions are being strained, and more cognitive functions are expected to be developing in those in speaking and listening. It's a more complex task. No two teams are the same. Like this beautiful fingerprint I came across, each one of us has a unique cognitive profile. And we have studied this. We have measured the unique nature of our cognitive profiles, because remember, we all have the same cognitive functions, but they're all operating at a slightly different level. So in combination with each other, there is incredible unique complexity to our profiles. Just like in real life, we have stronger players, capacities, and others less efficient or fatigue more quickly. And that unique profile, how we are all operating, is what shapes how that learning process feels. So this is another use of that cognitive lens, not only offering that explanation to what's happening under the hood, so to speak, cognitively, but it also explains why different learners have different experiences at different times. And it hopefully will give us some compassion, right? Some understanding and some compassion for others and even for ourselves. We can stop telling ourselves or our students or our children to just try harder or practice more, and more towards what players are under strain at this moment, who or what needs more training. Because in sport, we talk about this all the time. We have no expectation that a player will stay weak forever. There's no decision made in sport that to keep someone on the bench or to give up on a sport. There's an absolute recognition and expectation that any player is capable of improving. And the same goes for here. With the right kind of training and practice and coaching, players, these cognitive functions will develop. The same is true for the brain, and we'll talk about that shortly. But first, I want us to look at a few players that are essential in language, a few cognitive functions, particularly that are essential in acquiring new languages. The first is this player that stores and learns and produces sound structure, sound of our words and our language. This is Broca's speech pronunciation, and allows the brain to take in sound. And words, language, of course, are sounds, they're syllables, and each syllable integrating those into stable words, and then retrieving those patterns, those sound patterns, for speech expression. Now, it's not the mechanical aspect of speech. That's a different function, what we call kinesthetic. That's our tongue, our lips, even our teeth that are involved in speech articulation. This is a higher order function. It's retrieving and organizing sound into recognizable spoken words, internal memory for how words are pronounced and how syllables are sequenced into words. And when this function is weak, as it was for me, individuals are uncertain about pronunciation. I mean, I remember very clearly working with my, working with my tutor and not being able to hold a sound or phrase that they had just said long enough to be able to repeat it immediately afterwards, or certainly within a minute afterwards. It didn't affect my reading because I had strong visual memory. I could remember the look of the word, but the sound of the word and how to reproduce that sound was painfully effortful. And when we think about individuals who have a weak BROCAs, a weak sound memory, and also a weak visual memory, and perhaps a memory, I mentioned the motor planning in our hands as we write or type. That same motor planning actually helps our eyes track across the page. Well, if we have a team who also has poor motor tracking in our eyes, they lose their place, or they miss a letter, or they repeat a word again. So if we have multiple cognitive functions that are weak there, then reading or language in our first or second language is going to be difficult. And that's typically where a diagnosis of, for example, dyslexia is identified. So certainly when we're working with a new second language, particularly in speaking or in conversation, this function is essential. We have to have a strong phonics component. Excuse me. The next is predicative speech. Now, this function allows us to build meaning in the order of the words and the ideas. It's an internal system in our brains that holds language in sequence, so we can form and keep sentences in our mind. Language is constructed, right? It's constructed through word order, clauses, prepositions. Now, it's instructed differently in different languages, but first, I want to appreciate that this is the cognitive function responsible for that construction. Not the words themselves, but how they're arranged. And we do this through predicative speech. Think of it like a little voice inside of your head that lets us rehearse the language internally and almost test out the sentences as we speak. In essence, it allows us to think in sentences, in language, not just in words, not just in nouns and verbs, but in that whole linear sequence or song of language. And when it's strong, people can build and organize sentences in real time, so their communication becomes fairly easy. And even the complexity of their sentences is usually high because their capacity to reorganize, to almost play with language, is logical and secure and can be even creative. Novelists have an incredible skill here, writers. Now, when it's weak, difficulties appear typically in both understanding and expression. It's a both receptive and expressive, has expressive and receptive impact, this function, if it's weak. And a learner will likely understand individual words, but they'll struggle to craft those words into longer sentences because they can't hold the sequence long enough to follow it. So when speaking, you may notice that they rely on short or fragmented phrases, or they may misplace the elements, like a preposition, for example, when we commonly use, I went to loan the bank, instead of I went to the bank for a loan. So those nuances is this cognitive function. Now, as I said, in second language learning, we're really relying on this function because we have to actually build a new sequence, new rules of syntax and of grammar. So if this cognitive function is already weak, and then we're asking them to learn a new language, we're asking them to build a new language on top of an already unstable foundation of internally sequencing language. So it makes that second language significantly more effortful. And the last one I want to touch on or dig a little more deeply into is, I've talked about predicative speech, the last one that structures language. Symbol relations is what makes language meaningful. It's the light bulb in our heads when we make sense of something, where we say, aha, okay, I get it. When the connections of an ideas, when you've collected or synthesized ideas together to make sense of it. So this is the player I often hear my kids coach look over at someone on the field and say, oh, he has strong soccer IQ. And I didn't immediately understand what that meant, but it meant that physically That's not what they were talking about. They weren't talking about the accuracy of his passes. They weren't talking about how fast he was. They weren't talking about how aggressive he was. They were talking about his intelligence in understanding the game, the logic, the reasoning, the patterns, the complexity of the game, certainly that I couldn't see. He seemed to have it naturally. It's his cognitive function. It's his ability to recognize the discrete aspects or ideas or concepts that are happening in that field and synthesizing to make sense of it. Think of it like the connective tissue. We take in information that's new and we match it or map it with something that we know. We make sense of it. And in second language learning, this function is central because it allows learners not just to memorize, but to understand. And it's particularly important when meaning is not explicitly stated and it has to be inferred from context. So when this function is strong, learners can understand a conversation even if they don't know every single word, because they can infer the relationships and the concepts and build context from what they know. So they can follow conversations or stories or explanations in real time much more effectively when this cognitive function is strong. When it's weak, though, difficulty will show up in comprehension, in interpretation, and a person will rely heavily on literal translation. They'll miss implied meaning, and they'll find it difficult to follow conversations unless the ideas are really fully spelled out. So even if vocabulary is strong, the overall message can feel unclear because the relationships between the ideas are not effectively synthesized. So, as I said, that's just a bit of a deep dive into three particularly important cognitive functions, but there are others that shape our language and particularly our acquisition of our second language. As I said, I'd be happy to share this resource or related ones with Dr. Santos after the session. So please feel free to let her know if there's something in particular that you have a question or an idea around. But this, again, is another benefit of this cognitive lens. Let's call it task analysis. We can break down any task, whether it be a new language or an academic subject or a life skill like organization, and we can dissect it into its discrete parts. And we can effectively map out which cognitive functions are involved, which ones are strong or secure, and which ones are lesser so. And this can be really valuable in telling us how learning is likely being experienced, how much effort it actually requires. And there are tools available, if you're interested, to have your own cognitive profile created. Again, Sarah, Dr. Santos, opportunity here to connect with her, and she can give you some resources. Understanding our own cognitive profile, as it was for me, can be incredibly illuminating. It can be incredibly grace-giving, and it can really reveal and reinforce that struggles in second language, particularly, that we often think of as a skill or as a single skill, actually is a complex cognitive process, and that it's not a measure of intelligence or a measure of motivation or a measure of effort when it's difficult. It's a cognitive experience. I also want to recognize that further grace giving, that adults are likely at a greater challenge in learning second languages. And it's simply because how they typically engage with it. Now, first of all, I want to say it is a myth that all children are sponges. Of course, many children will struggle with learning languages, including their own language, in learning to read or express themselves, because they have particular cognitive profiles that make those learning experiences challenging. it is fair to say that children experience learning new language differently. First of all, they're typically more immersed. My children here in Canada are in French immersion. So they spend most of their day in French lessons. So it's a exposure, it's an immersion element. They're also, though, this is very important, in a period of their lives where they're comfortable making mistakes. It's just a natural part of their psychology that they are comfortable and used to making mistakes. And that's a very important part of learning, but also in cognitive experiences. And their brains are actively wiring. They're in a period of really active cognitive and developmental growth. So, of course, in many ways, it is a good time to be immersed in language and to learn in general, and certainly a second language. Whereas adults tend to have less immersion. Even, I'll confess, even when I was living abroad, I was teaching at an international school, so I was teaching in English during my day. Of course, my colleagues, my friends, my neighbors tried very hard to help me speak Spanish, and though they often flipped into English to convenience me, probably to convenience them, so that they didn't have to hear me struggle through it anymore. But in general, adults do have less immersion. But more importantly, they also have more self-awareness and probably more self-consciousness when they're learning. So there's, again, a slightly different psychology they approach to this. But more than anything else, they have well-established language systems in place. Their brains have done the incredible growth throughout their lives to have these established language and communication systems built. So it's just like when you go to another country who drives on the other side of the road and it feels almost, counter. Or if you try and brush your teeth with your non-dominant hand. I would suggest you try that tonight and see what it feels like. Mm-hmm. So let me move on to I'll slide past our summary. That's really just to put us into place and really look at the next really aspect of this cognitive lens. What do we do with all of this information? Well, as my nephew is experiencing, his brain is changing dramatically all the time. The brain changes. It's what we call neuroplasticity. And what's essential for us to appreciate is that this process happens throughout our lifetime. This very natural process may not happen as automatically or unconsciously as it does for my nephew, but it can absolutely be intentionally structured. It can be harnessed effectively. So rather than relying on our strong players, or rather than coping or managing with a difficulty or avoiding it altogether, if there is a cognitive function that is less efficient, undertrained, it's absolutely possible to strengthen that particular function. And programs like Aerosmith are built on these conditions of neuroplasticity. So Aerosmith is an example of applying neuroplastic conditions into practical settings. It's been offered since the early 80s. It was considered actually the first of its kind. Again, if you're interested in the history or the science of Aerosmith, please ask, and we'll be happy to share some resources to you. But effectively, this is a program that has been designed to intentionally support and foster growth through neuroplastic application, to create functional and structural changes in our brains throughout our lifetime that will ultimately lead to a different learning experience. Now, there is complexity to it, and there is effectively investment in it. And the reason is because it is complex to effectively change the structure, the wiring, the function of our brain. Wordle, I'm afraid, Wordle is not neuroplastic. Duolingo is not neuroplastic. And I promise no more World Cup soccer chat, but it really is similar to elite training. The brain has to be targeted, stimulated, progressively challenged, and repeatedly practiced to strengthen a certain function. And when it's strong, it's a better team player, and it can do its part in any task. So we have truly thousands of stories shared from children and adults and families and educators involved in Aerosmith, and several organizations like Sarah's there in Lisbon offer Aerosmith to children, to adults. What's interesting is there's many schools that offer Aerosmith that are dual curriculum, 2 languages. And what's interesting is as the students improve their performance, improve their cognitive program, they're improving their performance in both languages. Because when a cognitive function is strong, it's effective, more effective in whatever task it faces. It's not, as Sarah said at the top of our chat, it's not tutoring, but it's changing the cognitive function that learns more effectively. And I do want to, make clear that it doesn't replace the need to learn the language itself. It doesn't replace grammar. It doesn't replace vocabulary. Grammar and vocabulary still needs to be taught and acquired. Practice still needs to happen. But what changes is those cognitive functions are now trained and fit and actively participating in the game. Because there's no one player trying to make up for those weaker players. The brain is no longer working so hard. There's a greater efficiency. The studies show that learning actually accelerates. The rate of learning accelerates when the brain is strong. So the teaching doesn't change, but the brain's capacity to engage with it does. So if you take one thing away today, it's that struggling with language is not a reflection of your effort or my effort or your intelligence or your children's intelligence. It's a reflection of how certain cognitive functions are managing their jobs. So please reject that notion that we're just not good at languages or just not a language person, and instead look at yourself through a cognitive lens and explore what you can do to have a different experience. So I will pause there and thank you for your attention. And I'm going to stop sharing as well so I can
Thank you, Tara.
perhaps see
And
more of you.
I think before we take questions, I'd want to ground this into in practice. If you're interested in knowing more, I'll put the Aerosmith Cognitive Questionnaire link on the chat now, which means you can take the questionnaire for free and you can find out what are the cognitive functions that Tara talked about that may be a player that needs strengthening. Okay, and the report that comes out at the end, it's also a free service, and I'm very happy to discuss it with you to interpret that. I was going to put, and Tara, thank you so much. I want to then give you the floor for questions. I want to share here just a couple more messages. Yes, so in practice, what we can offer in terms of the Aerosmith program, it's a program that will provide individualized, intensive, targeted exercises that will strengthen those functions that need boosting so that learning can flow. I put a picture of there that is symbolizing synaptic space between neurons, because when the intensity of this program means that we max out that connectivity, the current connectivity of that neuron, so that new slots for receptors appear with that intensity. And this is what we mean by having a targeted and intensive program, is that those connections are stronger, there's more capacity of signal to flow at neuronal level, and when done repeatedly, it leads to long-lasting change, which means at some point you do not need to do more exercises because your daily life will keep that connection strong. So again, not tutoring, not strategies, it's at the brain level. At IngoC, we've been offering the program in schools. Oeiras International School here in Lisbon is an example. offered it also in this classroom behind me here in Barcarena in Oeiras, and as well as online for adults and children. These are group sessions that after we have a cognitive profile, where meaning we know where each function is in terms of their performance, within the group setting, you're working in your own exercise at your level, at your pace, at your goal, so that you can make cognitive gains whilst the trained expert facilitator, such as me, is working and with the students, small groups really that we're talking about. So there are case studies, we invite you to look at them. And just a little bit of background, I have a doctorate in mathematics, but I've been concerned with maths education for a long time. I've been a lecturer at university, I've been a school teacher, and worked with students with learning difficulties at all ages. And our Smith program is a solution I really like because we're not doing workarounds. We're not learning to cope or avoiding difficulties. We are strengthening the brain to increase the capacity to learn. And this is something I really value, the fact that I can also deliver it quite flexibly in terms of location and apparatus required. Yes, I mentioned the questionnaire, and I'm very happy to hear from you to know more and also share the resources as Tara mentioned earlier.